I feel a little, all right, it might just be easier. Thanks, Ellen. I'm a little puzzled at this moment just what would be most useful to us, because as I see those of you that are here, I'm very conscious that you already, several of you at least, have a fair amount of background in the area of family planning, but let me assume that there are still some kinds of information that we can share profitably. And then will you please feel comfortable, because I am, to interrupt if you want to. There's nothing set about this, and if there are questions that you have or comments that you have to make during the time, that's fine with me, and in any case I will stop soon enough so that we can have some time for questions or for sharing of some ideas. One of the things that we need to remind ourselves is the exponential growth that we're experiencing. I feel right now as though saying that is almost a broken record, because it is apparent in so many of our publications now. But then, at least when I think about students with whom I visited and who haven't really had their selective perception turned to population, education, family planning, they still sort of blink their eyes. And so to review that briefly, when we think about that man to early historic times really just maintained zero, and then in the middle 18th century 0.03, and that isn't much above zero in terms of growth, and at that point it took 240 years to double population. In the 1950s it was 1.0, and at that point we were reaching 2.5 billion population, and then we were doubling in 70 years. At the present, we, and these are world figures now, we are growing at the rate of a little over 2%, and we are now at 4 billion, and that's 35 years. So when you think of in the 1800s it was going to take 240 years, then in the 1950s, which isn't all that long ago, certainly to the younger ones of you in the audience, that it was going to take 7 years, and then 35, and now at the rate we're going, the expectancy is that we will be very close to 8 billion by 2000 or 2025. And I have a few transparencies that we can look at to help us to see why that is, and that will be true no matter how successful we are, or if we are successful in terms of tempering population growth. We're still going to see that kind of growth, so we need to be prepared for that. One of the things, of course, that made a great deal of difference in those early years was the malnutrition, the famine, the disease, the plague, the war. There were high death rates for all these reasons. Then there has been the decline, the sudden decline in mortality because of health services going in many parts of the world. I can remember back in 1955 when I was in Salzburg, Austria, on an international work camp, talking to an Austrian doctor, an MD, who had just returned from Afghanistan at that point, and was with the WHO, World Health Organization of UN, and he was commenting back at that time, and I didn't think about it so much then, I've thought about it since, that here they were in the process of bringing in these health services at that point in time, and yet paying no attention to the other point of that problem in terms of the births. And so for sure there is this period of disequilibrium while we're in the process of this transition. Those of us who are from developed countries then have gone past that, where now the birth rates are also down, and so we are back at an equilibrium. In terms of population education, family planning, really population problems, as we know by now, are on the agenda for many, many nations. We know that from the Bucharest Conference summer before last, the Rome Conference, the World Food Conference, and the Population Conference. I'm sure we also know there would be disparity among those of us here, and certainly in the mix of the population, there would be a lot of controversy, some of us strong partisans one way, some another. I expect not many of us feel very neutral about it. And that's all right, but we need to respect that and therefore try to keep as open as we can about the various points of view. No matter how I try, before the period is over, I expect you'll know where I stand on this, but in the meantime, we'll try to bring some of the kinds of issues that we need to look at, no matter what our point of view. Because what it does take of us, I think, is an understanding of the problems and the issues that are involved. And that understanding involves consequences. I think that we cannot really understand unless we go far enough to look at what the consequences of population changes are, because in essence they then become relevant to us personally, but certainly to the young people now and to our children, to our grandchildren. One of the other things, as we talk about the complicated problem of population education, family planning, it is that it's an accumulation of individual acts. That's very different than looking at a public health service where there can be an edict that we do such and such, and we have certain kinds of vaccination for something that's coming. We can do generalized kinds of things for health reasons, and this is acceptable. When we come, though, to population education, at least at this point in time, those are individual kinds of decisions. They are within the framework of government policy, but nevertheless, they still are individual decisions, and I think that forces us to look at the kind of problems that we talk about in a different way. It does mean, of course, that the effects of population growth affects social, biological, our environmental area, and certainly this is important to each of us. I think one of the things also that we need to look at and try to keep in mind are the relationship between population and the quality of life. This is really what we're talking about and why we're really concerned. And I think that we do recognize that any culture has its value system. Part of the problem is that we don't all have the same value systems. And we have to respect those other value systems, but they are other value systems. And so as we talk about some of the kinds of issues, as we talk about what is public policy, it has to be in the framework of what those, how we define quality of life and what the value system is for those persons. Let's look at a few transparencies that maybe would be helpful to visualize this a little bit. What I'm really trying to do is look at what is dynamics of population education. We'll talk some about population concepts and demographic analyses of countries. Now let us look at it in this frame of reference. I think as we talk, knowing that it's easiest when we say that this is an individual matter, it isn't hard for us to see things that relate specifically to us and to our family. That's easiest to see. But then as we push those ideas or concerns to the neighborhood, to the nation, to the world, it sort of disperses. And the same thing in terms of time. And I think another thing we need to remind ourselves is that time has a different value in lots of places in the world. It's a very high priority to us. A lot of people don't have that same orientation to time. So these affect why programming in population education family planning becomes difficult, because we have to get from here to this time span and to this space span. Okay, then we're really talking too about these, as the term is, the feedback loop. The number of deaths per year, the number of births per year, and this obviously is what we're talking about. That makes up the population, what we have, and the population growth. Put that then against this as another way of looking at that. And it is affected then by education, by health services, lots of things impinge upon this. Another way of looking at what affects world population is the availability of resources in this country or in others, what that economy is, the present form of economy, what those political policies are, what their religious orientation is. All of those are strong factors that affect this. Some may push much heavier. They aren't necessarily, this looks as though it's equal. It's not meant to infer that. Some push upon that much more strongly and are, have much more effect than others. Let's look at this now in trying to, when we talk about the bell-shaped curve, I'm not sure what is the term that is best. Some would prefer developing countries. If we won't quibble about whether we call them underdeveloped or developing or whatever, you do understand what I'm talking about in the differences in these. So that these are the age ranges. Now, if you take those by single countries, they many times will spill right off. This is so high, especially 0 to 1. 4 to 5 is considerably better. These charts are lumped together in 0 to 5. So if it were separated here, I'm sure you'd concur, Hester, that'd go much, much farther here. But then they come in like this. In contrast, for the developed countries, look at the difference in this shape. So that this gives you an orientation then of what is part of this problem. Now, when you put that then against a death rate, here's the United States, and let me see if then let me put Colombia. These are 10 years old, and I don't have 10 years later, but it isn't all that much different. It'll serve the purpose of what we're talking about. And here is Colombia. Now let me try and see if I can put those on top. Let's see. I guess, does that do it? Approximately. You can see what some of that difference is. Wouldn't be all that much different, Marie, in Venezuela or wherever in terms of these. And so this is part of what we're talking about, and these literally did spill off the end. All right, another way then of looking at that is to really determine what that population growth rate is. Here are the births, here are the deaths, and this is the difference. And this is that period of transition that we're talking about, where they're in disequilibrium. And then when you come down to, where's North America? The contrast of this. And this is in the area where you're getting maybe a 3.5% growth here and in here. Okay, another way of looking at this too is desired family size from some of these selected countries. One of the things as we think about this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, is what you have seen on some of these charts wouldn't jibe with this if we could put one on top of the other. Because in most of the instances, the desired family size is less than actual. I don't care who you ask. In the majority of instances, it's less. But even then, you see, look at what this is. Now, Philippines, all right, take the Philippines as a case in point. Here they're saying, I don't have the year on this, I think this was 70. But here they're saying 5. In 74, they were averaging 7. All right, averaging 7, you know, we know what that means. They're going to do real well to cut their average down by half. They think they're going to do very well to cut their birth rate to 4 per family, you see. And that's still considerably above replacement, which is something a little over 2. So this, another way of looking at this, I'll do these while I'm here and then I'll go back to. People say, well, it doesn't really make all that much difference. Yes, it does make all that much difference. Here is what would happen with 2 per family. This is US. This is not developing countries. This is US. Here's what would be at 2070. It's carried, you see, from here. Here's what it would be at 2070. And here's what it would be with 3. That's 1 more person per family. I think that sharpens for us what we're talking about. And we don't have to, I get concerned, we don't want to put ourselves in the position of saying that's somebody else. We need to look at what that means to us so that we can do some comparison. All right, another way then of looking at this too is here are when we're talking about growth rates, here you see for many, many years, clear up into here, that was running along fairly even. Then this is where public health services came in, you see. And so their death rate went way down and their birth rate hasn't adjusted much yet. So this is what we're experiencing right now. All right, put that then against this in terms of the developed countries. Now these will come to this, but we're talking about this lag in here right now that we have with us and isn't going to stop or change tomorrow, even if programs are successful. Now another way of comparing that this way, now this is more recent. That was in 1770 to 1970, this is 1940 to 1970, but it still gives you this to see what we're talking about. And certainly then, in terms of the World Food Conference we were talking about, we can see why there are problems, because indeed those people are there right now. Well, let's all right, now having seen those then, the 2/3 of the present population of the world are in developing countries and 1/3 in the developed countries. So that means that in those developing countries, those 2/3 are going to double their population at this rate in 28 years. That isn't very long. At the rate of the developed countries, it'll take 70 years. So in other words, an average of the developing countries is over 2.5. An average of the developed is 1%. I'm talking now about population growth. So therefore, the most rapid development is in those poorer countries, and the burden is where it can least be accommodated. No matter what one feels about it, that's what is real. And one of the reasons is that in those developing countries they have early marriage and virtually universal marriage. So that means a high birth rate. Now maybe I shouldn't take that for granted. Let me explain what I mean by that. When we think in terms, if you recall on that bell-shaped curve, over half the population, no, almost half the population, 47, 48, 49%, are normally in those developing countries under 15 years of age. Now that's what we're talking about, because from 15 to, say, 34, such is the most crucial years of childbearing. And so when you have half the population under 15, you've got a number of those getting into their fertile years right there and soon. And so this is, then when there is almost universal marriage, one of the significant ways then of lowering birth rates is increasing marriage year of the year that they're married, so that it simply diminishes by that length of time. And a number do that, but in the countries where we have this high population, that's not the pattern. And then with medical technology coming in, and with a very rapid decrease in deaths, why this has made a great deal of difference. So what we really are saying then is that whichever is cause and whichever is effect, and one can make points for both sides, high birth rates are the companion of poverty. You can say poverty induces it, you can say that induces poverty, but whichever, there's no doubt some of both. They do indeed go together. One of the things, too, when we talk about, remember, one of those factors was economic factors. Economic growth is proceeding in a number of these countries, and proceeding very well. But the problem is that the population is growing faster, and so the per capita is not being improved. I think we can't say that the economy isn't improving. We can say that the betterment of life for those individual people is not, because of the rate of population. Now, looking again then at the momentum of growth, one item to remind us is that the rate of growth, to think about what that is today, and then the next question is, what then will it be tomorrow, the long range tomorrow? And that we've got this momentum that's going to persist for some decades, because those persons are already in childbearing years. And high fertility simply can't be changed overnight. I think let's look at some of the consequences of these population trends on the world community. Many of us have friends abroad, either that we've known here or have traveled abroad. I think there's no question that everyone wants a higher standard of living for their family, whatever it is, wherever they are. They want something better for their family than they had for themselves. I think that's universal. They want better health for their children. They want more education for their children. They want a harmonious environment. I don't think we argue about those. The problem then is how to get to that, and how can we look at the consequences of what we're presently doing in terms of the value system then that those particular people have. Perhaps we should remind ourselves a little bit too of some of the cultural nuances that we better not take for granted. Another story that's not a new story, I think it was a Korean story in the first place, of this monkey and fish, and you may recall where the monkey, it was during a period of a flood, and the monkey scrambled up the tree, and he saw this fish struggling up the stream, and so he, in his humanitarian desire, reached down and scooped up the fish. And the fish wasn't very happy, and he, was surprised. And I suppose we could look at some of the things that we have done in terms of education and advising in technological development, that some of our laudable intentions weren't really so very well received, and received because of not understanding what those particular nuances were, what their value system was. And I expect that it's still fair to say that a number of us have cultural blinders that we're usually ignorant about in preventing us from fully understanding what the needs and desires are. Yet we do have the spirit to want to do something about it, and it's not a case of wanting to diminish that spirit. Another question I think that we need to raise then, some of you recall Dorothy Lee, who used to be with us on the campus. And I remember she was a cultural anthropologist, and I remember her talking about this topic and the ethics of change. And one of the things that she said was, when you come into a community, and even when you know and think you do understand some of these nuances, their value systems, some of the differences, and are there a while, is it right for you to bring in change? Because that's going to do something that's different than they already have. But then she raised the opposing question, is it right not to? And I think this is the dilemma that we keep having, because change will come eventually, and whether or not then we want to be involved in that, and if we are, then certainly as knowledgeably as we can, because certainly it is imperative that they do. Any of those changes, they do produce secondary and tertiary effects. One example that we were talking about was in terms of the water supply, and all the things that come with a water supply. You have to think about waste. I'm talking now about a developing country. They aren't used to thinking about that. You have to think about how to maintain the pumps. They don't have personnel that know how to maintain the pumps because they've never had pumps. You have to think about spare parts. They don't have spare parts. And how is communication and how is transportation to get those spare parts? You have to have some kind of administration to operate that. They haven't had that. They've had the social custom of going to the well to visit. It's an entirely different thing. If someone isn't using it, someone has to turn it off. They aren't used to turning it off. It's some of these kinds of things, no matter what the problem is, that really become very complex, and we need to try to think through what those consequences are. And the other kind of thing that's a sharp one, I guess, is we're used to eating beefsteak, others are used to maybe eating grasshoppers, Who says one is better than the other? We do, but it's because we're used to that. And some of these kinds of barriers that we have to overcome. Another thing in terms, and I'm saying this basically in terms of change, and then wanting to put that back into the perspective that as we talk about change through population education family planning, that again is an individual matter as well as a country matter. There's reason for fatalism that many people have, and it's a strong one. They don't think about having mastery over nature. We do. Many of them, as we've talked to women who have had these size families that we're talking about, they really expect in the first place that 50% of those won't grow up. That's why they have that many. Well, that makes us wince because one that does not mean that there is a different relationship in terms of concern for family. It's realistic from their point of view. And we need to respect that and why it is not easy to change. One of the things when we think about, there was one other story that I wanted to remember to tell you. Oh, I think it was a girl from Colombia who was talking about bride price, and the response of a U.S. person was, you know, gee, you require money and cattle for that? And the response was, you didn't? Don't you even think enough of her that it requires money and cattle? Well, you know, who says? We have other ways of getting that kind of value and in terms of norms. Another one in norms of modesty. I remember this story about the Amazon Indians that someone was telling about, that they were embarrassed if they were nude, but not if they had a string of beads. Well, this again, it's these kinds of patterns that are so so sharp to us because they are very relative. Let's look at a few of the major issues in terms of what needs to be considered by developing countries, by us as we work with persons in developing countries. And let me say, in terms of the ways in which we've been involved in home economics, that we have been involved in family planning and the integration of home economic subject matter into family planning at their request. And that at least makes us more comfortable because they are the ones that are asking. I remember even just last year, one of the Thai women was here from Bangkok, and she is in the Ministry of Education, and she is preparing materials to include family planning in their vocational system all around Thailand, the country of Thailand, for boys and girls. And I said, well, you know, we can learn a lot from you. We aren't at that point. And she said, well, we're the ones that have the problem. And that's all she said about that, which simply says to me, you know, okay, we're here. You can get that from us. We have some things that we can get from you, particularly in terms of areas of subject matter. But some of the kinds of things, let's look at a few of these. In terms of economic development, is it possible that there can be substantial improvement with their present organization? In terms of food, is it possible to feed and improve nutrition for a decent diet? It's one thing to increase the amount of food. It's a second thing to improve a diet. And we may do well enough to increase the amount of food and not improve the diet. Hopefully it would be both. One of the knotty problems is income distribution. Can we help so that if there is lowered fertility, that income can be distributed more equitably? We don't have to think very hard about some of the problems related to that. With lots of low income, lots of poor, and an elite, and little in between. And so we're talking about this. Can there be ways of finding gainful employment, both agriculturally and urban? One of the things, of course, that is happening is the movement from agriculture to urban, agricultural area to urban area. However bad it is in the urban area, a number of those families feel it's still better than what they had in the agricultural area because they hope to find employment, they hope to find health services, they hope to find education, and they don't have any of those in the rural area. when they really get there, whether they are better off is a moot question, but that's what still keeps pulling them. Will there be ways that they can extend the coverage and quality of education? I think one of the things that is difficult, extremely difficult for us to really internalize is what a big task that is when we talk about education. I remember the summer that I was in Malawi, and we went to visit a primary school. And the noise, it was an English class, and they were so proud, just so proud. They had all these kids, you know, packed into a schoolroom, sitting like three at a desk like this, you know, and they were reciting. And they didn't have any books, they didn't have any paper, and the teacher that they had happened to have a gosh awful voice, just terrible, kind of like up here, you know, all the time. And so here were 30 youngsters imitating that pitch as well as the sounds. But they didn't have anything else, you know. It's all, and it was just shattering. And then when we talked to that teacher afterwards, she had gone through 3rd grade and she was teaching 1st. And they were glad to have that much. That's what I think is hard for us to remember and we take for granted. So when we talk about increasing education, when we talk about literacy, it's a great big task, and it won't be done tomorrow, like population control won't be done tomorrow. In terms of health services, can they extend the quality of those health systems? How far and how fast? And how accepting will they be? I remember Dr. Xu in Taipei, I guess it was. He was talking about the development of programs in Taiwan. And I think this was about 1958, perhaps. And he was very interested in population education, family planning. But he said, I realized that the government wasn't, but they could buy all right pre-pregnancy health. So I just called it pre-pregnancy health. And then for some years they had pre-pregnancy health in their maternal and child health. And then they saw what that did, and then they could move into, and they had no problems with that, moving then into a positive stance in terms of family planning. And it was interesting to see that, you know, so I call that being creative with what those circumstances are. In terms of whether or not some of these developing countries can really do better than we have in utilizing resources without undue deterioration of the environment. I hope they learn some things from us as well, of what not to do as well as what to do. Another thing that's a crucial thing is in terms of women's rights. As we have been reading over the past some months, as you read some of the outcome and reporting of the IWI conference, International Women's Year Conference, last summer in Mexico City. Certainly, there's much to be done worldwide in the status of women. And I think that probably one of the factors that will have some of the most effect on what we're talking about will be what is that ultimate role of women. As it is not difficult to document that as women are educated first, and then as women are employed second, that the numbers of children decrease. And one doesn't have to explain, certainly to a group of women, why that is. And besides, then, they're finding more fulfillment themselves. I think when we look back at that chart and know that the desired number of women, or number of children, is not the same as the number they have, is related to this. Because in many cases, the status now is the number of children they have. That is their status in that society. And it's a very deep-seated one. And that isn't going to change tomorrow either. And this is something that I think we need to be sensitive to. I think one of the things that we are saying is that we hope that families, couples, and particularly the women, that they have the privilege of determining spacing of children. If they could do just that and nothing else, many kinds of things would be solved. Because most women are not going to choose to have a youngster every year. They know that's debilitating health-wise. And I don't worry about them making that kind of decision if they have the option. The problem is helping them to know there is such a thing as choice, and then to help them to know that there are services available to them. And so in terms of what, again, we've been trying to do in home economics, it's not the services. We've been trying to help them to see what is important to them in decision making with their families, so that then they can see why the use of those services are important. One reason that some of the family planning programs haven't been effective is that if there have been family planners that are out in communities getting them to that family planning clinic and getting however many pesos or whatever per person that they get, that doesn't keep them coming, because they don't really see that there are all these other kinds of consequences related to it. So in terms of women's rights, but the broader topic than that really is human rights. It isn't a case of gender. Obviously, women are the one that bear the children, and so I think it is appropriate to give them their due amount of time, but it is a family affair. And what we're really talking about is whether or not these limitations can be seen in terms of improving the human beings who are produced. That's ultimately what we want to be done. And we want to be sure that couples then are enabled to be able to control the fertility as they want to for health and humanitarian reasons. So then, ultimately, we're talking about two things. We're talking about trying to be aware of accommodating the inevitable larger population we're going to have. And then the next one is trying to look at what growth is desirable and how can we help people to achieve that. And I don't think any of us want to be in the position where that's legislated or enforced. I think we wince at that. I think we all are concerned in terms of the human beings that are involved and for their betterment and for the lives that they have. Now, let me pause there and see if any of you have any kinds of questions or comments. One of the things that I have thought has been a good summary for the kind of comments made just now is in terms of Toynbee. I happen to enjoy Arnold Toynbee very much, and a while back I was cleaning files, and I found an article that he had written back in 1959, which isn't yesterday. And let me just share it with you in terms of what we're speaking about. He was speaking at the 10th FAO conference in 1959. And this is what he said. All over the world, till lately, and in most of the world still today, mankind in its sexual life has been following the course of nature. That is to say, it has been breeding up to the maximum. And that's in terms of that beginning of that chart we were talking about. To let nature take her extravagant course in the reproduction of the human race may have made sense in an age in which we were also letting her take her course in decimating mankind by the casualties of war, pestilence, and famine. Being human, we have at last revolted against that senseless waste. We have started to impose nature's heartless play, a humane new order of our own. But when once man has begun to interfere with nature, he cannot afford to stop halfway. We cannot, with impunity, cut down the death rate and at the same time allow the birth rate to go on taking nature's course. We must consciously try to establish an equilibrium, or sooner or later, famine will stalk abroad again. And here we come back to the heart of our problem. The death rate can be reduced by public action taken by the few. The birth rate can be reduced or stabilized only by private action taken by the many. What is the true end of man? Is it to populate the earth with the maximum number of human beings that can be kept alive simultaneously by the world's maximum food supply? Or is it to enable human beings to lead the best kind of life that the spiritual limitations of human nature allow? The first of these two possible objectives seem irrational. What matters surely is not that the surface of this planet should hold, say, 4,000 million instead of 3,000 million living human beings. What matters is that living beings, whatever their number, shall develop the highest capacities of their nature. And if this is the true end of man, what we should aim at is the optimum size of population for purpose in the economic and social circumstances of each successive generation. I thought he said that very nicely. So thank you for coming.
Julia, one of your points, I think it's really important that there must be a government policy of if population planning is going to work in a given country. In your travels around the underdeveloped countries, do you find that there's any one group or any one thrust that, you know, once the government says, okay, it puts it on the television, puts billboards by the railroad station, that sort of thing, who's out there at the grassroots doing any good and getting the word out to these people with a third grade education or first grade? You know, is there anything plus that we can look at now and encourage?
Oh, I think so. I think that one of the things that is increased first is, it seems to me where this starts first is in maternal and child health, public health, in any country. And part of it is how many stations can they man? How much of a budget will be allocated? So that's government allocating that. The same thing would be true in terms of education, like this one I was describing from Thailand. They've done a great deal, and they are committed to this. There are the organizations that are old, respected organizations, International Planned Parenthood, UNFPA, United Nations Fund for Population Activities, I guess it is. I always have a hard time stumbling over those initials. So there are a number of supporting groups, and one of the things I guess we really didn't talk about is that it's not easy, for example, in a Muslim country, in a Catholic country, to get this kind of thing going. But it is interesting that in the Philippines, for example, as you know, is basically Catholic, 90% plus. They have a government position supported by Marcos. They have a strong federal, national coordination of family planning efforts. And when I was out there in '74 at this workshop for extension, which was what we call state and regional and field staff, they had 3 priests, 2 of them for and 1 against, and talking about this, and very open about this. Colombia, I think, is a case where it's kind of gone up and down. There was a period about 5 years ago, as I remember, Maria, when they were more supportive than they are right now. Maybe that's changing again, but part of that was that it was in self-defense. There were so many self-induced abortions that there was much concern by the church that if one uses a term lesser of two evils, then that was one of them, because they were very concerned about that. But you may know better than I'm not sure right now, but I think that we've had trouble, in the last 2 years getting confirmation of people coming because the government wouldn't support them coming. And maybe the same is true in Venezuela right now.
Well, in that paper that we found in Venezuela,
Yeah.
it says how much Colombia in the last years have increased the services in family
So they're
planning.
coming back up again.
I don't know the support of the government,
Mhm.
but I feel it's not the same as the support of the government in Venezuela.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. So it's not an easy route, but I guess I feel in spite of all this that I'm sharing, I feel relatively optimistic, because I suppose one reason I do is that we're working with people who are trying to do something about it positively. And so it's not a short-run success story, but in a long run, I do have confidence that there will be ways to accommodate, and I do feel that there are a number of agencies and such that are ready and moving in a support system, if I'm speaking to the kind of question you're raising. Helen?
I think, I don't know, because I hear your question right, it's like, did you say the government supports? No, I think most times the government has to support the program, otherwise there's no way.
Yeah, I think that's essential.
Yes.
What I wondered was, the question was, a group like International Planned Parenthood, for example, if the government says go,
Mhm.
Puts it on the telly and says,
Mhm.
we're hot for family planning, then who are the effective groups? Is it
Mhm.
coming from the government?
I think it has to go concurrently. Isn't that what you're saying, Helen? That it needs to go concurrently. It is government support. It is these other private agencies.
When I send the contribution to Planned Parenthood,
I think
is it
it's
really going to where it ought to go?
Oh, indeed. I wouldn't hesitate. Indeed, I wouldn't hesitate. They're an organization that don't take all the cream off the top. The people that are working in that are committed persons, any that I've seen.
Yeah, and it takes
A
a long time.
long
I think
time.
in Taiwan, it takes at least 15 years to get a whole program.
Right.
And this, like you said, so many cultural value there, and if they value children so high, there's no way to convince them, say, keep your children to 4, if you have 7, keep to 4, they say, why? I need children. And whole economics, from agriculture to industrialization.
Right. They need them for work.
But the children cost such a raise a child costs such a amount of money in the agricultural society, that they see the problem there, and they're willing to change. There's so many factors there, and we really cannot say, which one. I can see 15 years ago, first time, maybe 20 years ago,
Mhm.
first started in Taiwan. It was so hard, people just don't believe it, and they say, if I have one more children, what's the difference it makes?
Mhm.
I want 1 more, 2 more, what's the
Mhm.
difference if I can afford it? Now
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
like laying or freezing and everything.
Now, in Taiwan, you can correct me on this, Helen, it seems to me that in a period of 10 years, they decreased their population growth from 3% to 2.5, which is really very rapid. They are one of the more successful, they in Korea.
Yeah, I think one thing's really interesting. I remember when I was, maybe 15 years ago when we first started this, the
Mhm.
ideal family size is 3 children.
Mhm.
It's about 10 or 15, I couldn't recall exactly, but I remember when I was a kid, I went to school, we always Mr. Andrew always said, the ideal family is like the street. And about 4 years ago, five years ago, the ideal family is like the street.
Two.
You know, we have to, you just couldn't tell that two.
Is there social pressure, just among the people? You know, if a woman is bearing her fourth children,
No.
child, sorry, bearing her fourth child,
No, personally,
is
I
there
don't-
any
I-
social stigma?
It isn't that far yet.
Yeah.
Isn't that
No,
far
because-
yet? Mm-mm.
As I understand it, that's what happened in Japan.
Mhm.
You know, when they passed the law in 1948 legalizing abortion,
Mhm.
and it began to be used as their family planning method, that's
Yeah.
all they had, everything else was illegal and all the dumb things.
Mhm.
Anyway, but it worked.
Mhm.
And I understand from Japanese people I've talked to, that there is a social stigma if a woman starts whipping out her third child,
Mhm. Mhm.
she's looked down on.
Mhm.
no, they're still very child.
Yes, it's-
But that was a very strong statement that the Japanese
Yes.
Diet made in 1948.
Yes.
That said, we gotta cut it down.
Well, and the other thing in your Chinese heritage certainly is the sons. You know, it isn't just the number of children, but two sons.
Three daughters, if you keep on, you know, until the son is coming alive.
And if that takes seven, it takes seven.
Five daughters, you know, then they look you down. The
Uh-huh.
son is okay, the 10 is fine.
Mhm.
I mean, there's so many things, I don't know, it's really hard to say which ones. You think?
Wonder if our if our genetic manipulation will help this. I don't see how we can get out into the boondocks to determine sex of children, but that's coming in the near future.
That'll be, well, the next some years will be interesting
It
too.
can be done now, in a sort of backward way, but.
I think one of the things now is that the kinds of decisions that we're talking about are lots harder decisions than we had to make.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, yours will be much harder to make than ours. The forces are so different that's not easy.
Heckle, in this country, when Ray and I got married, it was expected that you'd have 4 kids.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
And
It's from, I think there's a social pressure right here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's only really becoming acceptable for young people to not have any.
And to be
children.
childless.
In our own country,
Yeah, to
without
be-
being looked
it's
down
only
upon because
socially
they don't.
acceptable to the non-potential grandparents. Have I stated that correctly?
Well, you probably have, but
But I don't read you.
No.
grandparents still want to be
A couple gets
grandparents.
married, their parents want grandchildren, and the pressure is on. I
Yes.
hear this from the students.
Oh, sure, but there's,
Yes, but I don't think that's universal.
there are still
I think that's changing.
a little.
I think more than you,
Oh, I think that
more
is
than
right.
you recognize, but it used to be just everybody, you know.
But the rest of society is much more supportive of the young couple that
Yes.
says, I want one or I want
But
one.
I think
Than the
you'll
parent.
find,
They're not supportive.
grandparents who are concerned about, our ecology and our
Mhm.
environment and everything else, to the extent that, the adoption process is helping them a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's slow, yes, but I think there's a hint of it around, right?
Oh, yes, I do too. It wasn't even conversation among
That's the
students
only way
not too
to
long
do it,
ago.
right.
Mhm.
Julie, where do you feel are the areas of greatest resistance in the world? What country?
I guess I would think the Muslim countries first, and then probably Catholic next. Would you think so, Maria? I believe it's even the greatest resistance. I think it'd be the strongest. How would you feel about that, Helen?
I don't know how, I'm not the biggest, I with the population, we have so many samples of the Middle East, how successful they are. So, this area.
Yes.
I don't know anything. Because we used to talk to some students or other country and they say, we want, even they are here.
Yes.
We talk to students who are five. Yes, five.
From which country?
Arab countries, she's saying.
Arab country, but we have students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I couldn't recall exactly what it's called.
I think in a generalized fashion, to try and answer your question, I think that probably Muslims first would be the hardest to crack. But I remember S.P. Keeney, who has been with International Planned Parenthood in Asia, in your area of the world, for 25 years, a choice human being. He's 70-something now. And he was saying, well, what that really says, it takes longer. It isn't that you can't do it, just takes longer, which I think is behind your question, you know.
Is that because, I mean, when you talk about, I'm not familiar with.
Right. Well, because their own cultural mores are so strong in terms of the roles of women, and that the role of women is to bear children, and that's very, very strong.
Is that because the woman is not open to the
Right,
outside?
right.
So they don't.
It's related to that, certainly. Yes.
But there is some help coming through the, I shouldn't have tried to explain this because I can't think of the, I want to talk about the current wife of one of the rulers. Let's disclose it's who has come out in support of
Yes. Yes.
women's rights in,
Yes.
now what country am I talking about?
The Queen of Egypt is pretty strong on that.
Right.
This is,
No.
well, there is one who has
Well, it'll take that, and that comes little by little.